Hey there, welcome to Mr.Cozy True Crime Stories. Tonight, we're diving into 2 hours of gripping true crime cases. Real stories of mystery, betrayal, and cold-blooded crimes, all set against the soothing backdrop of rain. It's the perfect blend of calm and unsettling. If these cases draw you in, tap that like button, share with your fellow true crime lovers, and subscribe to join our curious community. I'm always wondering, where are you tuning in from? And what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments below. Now settle in, and let's dig into the darkness. Story 1. The afternoon of August 2nd, 2017, arrived in Jacksonville, Florida with the particular heaviness that summer carries in the American South. Heat that doesn't lift with the sun but instead settles deeper into the evening air, pressing against skin and pavement alike. It was, by every outward measure, an ordinary Wednesday. Traffic moved along San Jose Boulevard in the familiar rhythms of late afternoon. Families were finishing dinner. The restaurants along the Strip were filling with the early crowd. And in a modest home not far from all of it, a 21-year-old woman named Savannah Gold was lacing up her black shoes, preparing for another shift. Savannah was young in the way that carries a particular brightness, not just in age, but in spirit. She was artistic, with a genuine love for design that she had pursued at school before work and life began filling the hours. She had a warmth that people remembered, a laugh that came easily, a loyalty to the people she loved, a tendency to look after others even when she herself needed looking after. She lived with her parents, and the arrangement spoke not of dependency but of closeness, a family that still chose each other's company willingly. That Wednesday, she kissed no one goodbye in any dramatic way. She simply walked out the front door at approximately 5:15 in the evening, dressed in her work uniform, black shoes, black trousers, white chef jacket, and made the short drive toward the Bonefish Grill on San Jose Boulevard, where she worked as a server. She never walked through the restaurant's front door. The Bonefish Grill was a casual seafood restaurant, the kind of place that fills with regulars who appreciate the consistency of a good meal in a familiar setting. The staff there knew each other well, as people who worked the same shifts in close quarters always do. Savannah had been there long enough to have built relationships, friendships, histories, the small intimacies that form between people who share the odd hours of restaurant work. One of those relationships, however, was more complicated than the others, and it was complication of a kind that would cost Savannah Gold everything. Lee Rodarte Jr. was 28 years old and held the title of culinary manager at the Bonefish Grill. He was, by all outward appearances, a man who had things together, a management position, authority, a visible role within the restaurant structure. He was described a man who had never once raised a hand to anyone. Rodarte and Savannah had been, in the language that people use when a relationship resists simple categorization, on and off. They had gone to dinner together, spent time outside of work, built the kind of familiarity that implies genuine feeling. But the relationship was technically forbidden. Company policy prohibited the kind of romantic entanglement that existed between a manager and a staff member, and Lee Rodarte had apparently been very invested in keeping his professional standing intact. Savannah's best friend knew about Rodarte. Savannah's mother had been told about him, had even planned a dinner at their family home that Rodarte had failed to show up for. She had called him a liar, this mother who had not yet lost her daughter, and she had been right about him in ways she had not yet understood how fully to fear. At 5:31 in the afternoon, the surveillance cameras mounted in the Bonefish Grill parking lot captured Savannah Gold arriving for work. She stepped out of her white 2007 Kia Spectra, her uniform neat, her expression giving nothing away to the lens of a camera that did not know it was recording the last images of her alive. She did not go directly to the restaurant entrance. Instead, she walked to a nearby car, Lee Rodarte's vehicle, and spoke with him through the rolled-down window on the driver's side. Whatever passed between them in those 14 minutes was private, unheard, visible only in its outlines. Perhaps it was an ordinary conversation. Perhaps it was something else. The footage cannot tell us the words, only the moments. At 5:45 in the afternoon, Savannah Gold got into the passenger seat of Lee Rodarte's car. What happened next was recorded by a camera that had no loyalty to anyone, no interest in protecting the innocent or shielding the guilty. The footage simply captured what it saw, the car beginning to move in a way that was not consistent with driving. The vehicle rocked. The doors swung open, and then were pulled closed. Open again, closed again, a terrible rhythm that has the physical evidence of a struggle. Savannah, 5 feet tall and unarmed, fought inside that car. She tried to get out. The doors recorded her attempts, the car's movement recorded her desperation, and the surveillance camera recorded all of it from a distance that was close enough to see and too far to stop. Then Lee Rodarte climbed out of his vehicle. He walked with deliberate calm to Savannah's white Kia Spectra, which was still parked nearby. He opened the driver's door and leaned inside. He had taken something from inside the car, removing what he needed before doing what he had already decided to do. Then he moved to the front left tire of Savannah's vehicle and punctured it. It was a detail of almost methodical coldness. He slashed the tire of a woman who could not use the car anyway. He was covering something, making sure a car that was not going to be driven appeared as though it had simply broken down in place. The previous day, Savannah had replaced that very tire. It had been brand new. At approximately 6:04 in the evening, Lee Rodarte drove away from the Bonefish Grill parking lot. Savannah Gold was never seen exiting his vehicle. At 6:30 that evening, Savannah's parents received a text message from their daughter's phone. The message said, "Hey, I just needed to tell you, and Mom, I met a really great guy, and we are running away together. I love him, and we are leaving to Ait. I'll call you later when we get TK where we are glong." Her brother received a separate message. "Hi, quit. I'm leaving with my boyfriend. I can't do this shit. Anything, I'm fine. Just want to get away." Savannah's parents stared at these messages and felt the cold certainty of people who know their child. This was not Savannah's voice. It was not her cadence, not her language, not her rhythm. The spelling errors were not the casual typos of a person texting quickly. They were the errors of someone unfamiliar with how the phone's owner normally wrote. Savannah had left their home 1 hour ago in her work clothes, without packing so much as a change of clothes, without saying goodbye in any way that suggested a life-altering departure. And now her phone was telling them she had met a man and was running away with him. No purse, no ID, no wallet, no warning, no goodbye. The story collapsed under the weight of everything her parents knew about the daughter they had raised. They called her. Silence. They tried her social media. Silence. They drove to the Bonefish Grill parking lot and found her white Kia Spectra sitting unlocked in the heat, a front tire slashed, her wallet and ID still on the front seat. The valuables untouched. The car abandoned. The tire freshly destroyed. Savannah Gold was reported missing that night. Her family, sick with worry, moved with the frantic energy of people who know that time is not neutral, that every passing hour carries its own weight when someone is gone. They made missing person flyers. They distributed them in the neighborhood, around the restaurant, throughout Jacksonville. Friends joined the search. The community began to pay attention. And through all of it, Lee Rodarte, the culinary manager, the man last seen with Savannah on the parking lot camera, appeared at the Bonefish Grill and helped put up missing person flyers. He expressed concern for Savannah to her devastated parents with a face that gave nothing away. He was the kind of man who could do that. The kind of man who could shake the hand of a grieving mother and distribute her daughter's photograph while knowing precisely where the daughter was. Detectives from the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office moved quickly. The parking lot surveillance footage was reviewed, and within the timeline of Savannah's disappearance, the story it told was unmistakable. A young woman arriving for work. A conversation with a coworker. An entry into that coworker's vehicle. A struggle. A man emerging to slash a tire. A car driving away. No woman exiting. The footage did not tell investigators everything, but it told them enough. They brought Lee Rodarte in for questioning. He denied being with Savannah on the day she disappeared. He had not seen her. They had not met. He had no idea what had happened. He maintained this position for some time, and then his story shifted. Not cleanly, not to something better, but shifted in the uneasy way of a lie trying to accommodate the evidence being placed before it. Investigators watched the changes. They presented what they knew. And then, 3 days after Savannah Gold walked out of her parents' home in her white chef jacket and black shoes, Lee Rodarte broke. He admitted it. He told the detectives that he had been in the parking lot with Savannah Gold. He told them there had been a struggle in the vehicle. He told them he had killed her. And then, in a detail that confirmed every calculation he had made in the hours following her death, he told them he had disposed of her body, and he offered to show them where. The Jacksonville Sheriff's Office dive team was dispatched to a pond near a patch of woodland off Duclay Club Road on the city's west side. They entered the dark water with the focused, methodical determination of people doing one of the most difficult jobs that exists, looking for the remains of someone who deserved far better than to end here. They found her, the young woman whose parents had replaced her tire the day before, whose family had been handing out flyers, whose phone had been used to send messages no one who knew her believed for a single moment. Savannah Gold's cause of death, investigators would later confirm, could not be precisely determined due to the condition of her remains. But what they could confirm, and did confirm, in a news segment that circulated through Jacksonville and beyond, was that her death had been violent. She had injuries covering approximately 75% of her body. Whatever happened in that car on that August afternoon was not swift or simple. Savannah had fought. The evidence of her struggle was written on her, and on the surveillance footage, and in the way the car had rocked with the force of someone who refused to surrender without resistance. Lee Rodarte was arrested and charged with second-degree murder and tampering with evidence. The case, already devastating in its basic facts, acquired a texture of additional horror when investigators and observers began to understand what investigators believed was the motive. Lee Rodarte was a manager. Savannah Gold was, in the eyes of company policy, a subordinate with whom a romantic relationship was forbidden. Their on and off relationship, kept quiet, partially hidden, known only to those closest to Savannah, represented a risk to his position. The suspected reasoning, as it emerged through the investigation and subsequent legal proceedings, was chilling in its smallness. A man, it was believed, who killed a 21-year-old woman because he feared she might tell someone about their relationship and cost him his job. In the months that followed, Lee Rodarte navigated the legal process in ways that seemed to suggest a man still unwilling to fully own what he had done. In November 2017, despite having confessed to investigators and led them to Savannah's body, Rodarte entered a plea of not guilty to the charges against him. Legal experts explained that this was procedurally common, that a defense attorney's obligation is to examine evidence and test its strength regardless of a client's earlier confession. But it was, for Savannah's family, a reopening of a wound they were trying to close. The case moved slowly through the Florida court system, as serious murder cases often do. Hearings were scheduled and rescheduled. Legal arguments were made. At one point, Rodarte's defense floated a claim of self-defense. The idea that Savannah Gold, 5 feet tall and unarmed, had somehow posed a threat that required a lethal response from a grown man with a clear physical advantage. It was an argument that collapsed quickly under scrutiny, but its filing was, for the people who loved Savannah, a particular kind of cruelty, a suggestion that the young woman whose body bore injuries over 3/4 of its surface had somehow brought this upon herself. Then, in February 2021, nearly 4 years after Savannah Gold disappeared from a parking lot in Jacksonville, Lee Rodarte changed his plea. He stood before a court and admitted to second-degree murder. The plea was the result of a negotiated agreement between prosecutors and defense attorneys, and it carried a sentence of 40 years in Florida State Prison, with credit for time already served. On March 11, 2021, Judge Jeb Branham formally sentenced Lee Rodarte Jr. in a courtroom where Savannah Gold's absence was the loudest presence. Her family was there. They had waited 4 years for this moment, through the missing person flyers and the dive team and the confession and the not guilty plea and the self-defense filing, and all the delays and continuances of a legal process that often seems poorly designed for the people it most directly affects. They had waited, and now they sat and watched the man who had taken their daughter be told the terms of his confinement. Savannah's mother spoke publicly in the time around the sentencing. She was a woman whose faith had clearly been tested in ways that no parent should have to endure, and her words carried the particular authority of grief that has not been softened by time. She had not believed in capital punishment before. She had not wanted to be someone who desired suffering for another human being. But she looked at what Lee Rodarte had taken from her, the living, breathing, laughing, designing, loving daughter who had walked out of her home in a white chef jacket, and she broke down. "And it's still not enough," she said. "Nothing would ever be enough. That is the particular mathematics of this kind of loss. The arithmetic simply does not balance. A 40-year prison sentence is a significant legal consequence and an entirely inadequate human response to what was lost." Savannah Gold was 21 years old. She had interests and ambitions, and the kind of warmth that leaves a mark on every person she touched. She had a best friend who had met her on-again, off-again boyfriend and remembered it later, when everything changed. She had parents who replaced her tire the day before someone else used that same tire's destruction to cover a crime. She had a future, design, perhaps, or art, or simply the unwritten chapters of a life that had only just begun, and all of it was taken from her in the passenger seat of a car in a restaurant parking lot on an ordinary August afternoon. The surveillance footage from the Bonefish Grill parking lot became one of the most discussed pieces of evidence in the case, not because it resolved every question, but because of what it revealed about the final minutes of Savannah Gold's life. She had not been caught off guard somewhere private and vulnerable. She had been in a public parking lot on a Wednesday evening, surrounded by the ordinary infrastructure of daily life. Other cars, a restaurant full of people, the broad daylight of a Florida summer. And still it had happened. The footage showed what it showed, and it could not be unseen. A young woman trying to get out of a car, doors swinging open, the vehicle rocking with the evidence of her resistance, and then a man walking calmly to slash her tire while the world continued its business all around him. The texts sent from Savannah's phone that evening remain among the most quietly devastating details in a case full of them. The messages were designed to create a narrative. A young woman running away, a spontaneous romance, a deliberate departure. They were designed to buy time, to redirect concern, to turn a search for a missing woman into something that might be dismissed as a personal choice. But Savannah Gold's family knew their daughter, and they refused to be redirected. The spelling, the cadence, the content, none of it matched the woman they had known for 21 years. A mother and father who paid attention, who recognized the particular texture of their child's voice in a text message, who held firm in their belief that something was wrong even when the phone was offering them the comfort of an alternative explanation. Their refusal to accept the false narrative is part of why Savannah Gold was found at all. Lee Rodarte is currently serving his 40-year sentence in the Florida state prison system. He was 28 years old when he killed Savannah Gold in a parking lot and disposed of her body in a pond on the west side of Jacksonville. He will be in his late 60s before the law releases him, assuming he serves his full term. The years he will spend inside a cell are real years, real time, real consequence, the slow accumulation of days inside walls. Savannah Gold does not have that time. She does not have days or walls or the slow accumulation of anything. She has a Facebook page her family has left public as a memorial, a GoFundMe that raised funds for funeral expenses and donations to animal charities and art schools and domestic violence organizations in her name, and the permanent, aching presence of her absence in the lives of everyone who loved her. In Jacksonville, along San Jose Boulevard, the Bonefish Grill continues to operate. Cars pull in and out of the parking lot on ordinary afternoons, and servers walk through the front door in their work uniforms, and the evening crowd fills the tables with the pleasant noise of people choosing where to sit and what to order. Most of them do not know what the parking lot surveillance cameras recorded one August evening in 2017. Most of them do not know the name Savannah Gold. But her family knows. Her best friend knows. The detectives who watched that footage know. The dive team that entered that pond knows. And the mother who sat in a courtroom in 2021 and said it's still not enough knows, with the absolute certainty of someone who has lived inside this knowledge every single day, that the story of Savannah Gold does not end with a sentencing. It ends and begins and returns in the way that loss always does, without warning at ordinary moments in the space where a person used to be. Story 2. The night of December 22nd, 2025, began like countless ordinary evenings in Lakeland, Florida. The air carried the first cool breath of the holiday season, and across the quiet neighborhood, homes were wrapped in Christmas lights, their warm glow promising a family warmth that seemed universal, eternal, unbreakable. Inside one of those homes, Crystal Kenny was doing what mothers do, managing the delicate, invisible architecture of a household, keeping the peace, trying to hold together a family that had already begun to crack along its seams. She did not know, as she moved through the house that night, that before midnight arrived, everything she had tried to hold together would shatter beyond repair. Crystal Kenny was a woman of deep faith and quiet resilience. A mother of 3, she had built her life around her children, a 13-year-old daughter, a 12-year-old son, and a 1-year-old baby girl she shared with her husband Jason. She had married Jason Kenny 2 years before, in what she had hoped would be a fresh chapter, a partnership, a love that would give her children a stable home. But love, when it lives alongside addiction, rarely stays stable. Somewhere along the way, the man she married had slipped into habits that frightened her. She had watched it grow, the drinking, the disappearances into the shed out back, the smell of alcohol on his breath, the erratic moods. And she had tried, in the quiet and private way of someone who still believed in redemption, to reach him before it was too late. At some point before that final night, Crystal had written him a letter. It was not an accusation. It was a plea, the kind written by a woman who still hoped that words could reach a man that actions had failed to move. In careful, earnest language, she had written, "You're drinking, you're using drugs again. This is not the way the family should be. You need God." The letter was not a demand for separation. It was an outstretched hand. That kind of woman Crystal Kenny had been. Not someone who gave up, but someone who fought for her family until she could no longer fight. On the evening of December 22nd, Jason Kenny had spent much of the night in the shed behind the house. He had been drinking, steadily, heavily, alone in that small enclosed space, away from the lights of the home and the presence of his wife and children. Outside, the Monday night football game between the San Francisco 49ers and the Indianapolis Colts was playing, and in the final minutes of the game, something pulled him back inside. Perhaps he wanted the bigger television. Perhaps he wanted the comfort of the living room, the couch, the warmth of an indoor space. Whatever his reason, Jason Kenny walked through the back door and into the house that was, at its core, his family's home. Crystal was already inside. When Jason moved to take control of the television and resume watching the game, Crystal objected. It was a simple, human moment, a wife expressing that the hour was late, that the children were present, that perhaps the football game could wait or be turned off. But for a man already clouded by alcohol and whatever else had taken hold of him that night, the objection was not something he could absorb with grace. What followed was an argument, escalating, dark, pulsing with a tension that quickly crossed from ordinary disagreement into something far more dangerous. Crystal knew her husband's moods. She had lived with them long enough to recognize when a situation shifted from uncomfortable to threatening. In a moment of terrifying clarity, she made the most important decision of that night, not for herself, but for her son. She looked at her 12-year-old boy and told him, calmly and firmly, to go next door to the neighbor's house and call 911. In that single instruction was everything a mother could offer. The instinct to protect, the willingness to absorb the danger herself so her child could survive it. The boy obeyed. He ran. He had barely cleared the threshold, barely stepped into the cool December air, when he heard the first gunshot. It is impossible to know what passed through Crystal Kenny's mind in those final seconds. Whether she felt the weight of all she was leaving behind, her children, her faith, the letter she had written, the hope she had refused to surrender. What the evidence would later confirm is that she was shot in the head. She died inside the home she had tried to keep whole. She was found by arriving deputies, still and silent, the Christmas lights still burning outside. But Jason Kenny was not finished. His 13-year-old stepdaughter was still in the house. She was a child who had, in the space of a few minutes, watched her world collapse. Whether she tried to hide, whether she tried to reason with him, whether she ran, the record does not say. What it does say is that she begged. According to Polk County Sheriff Grady Judd, who would later stand before cameras and relay her words with visible emotion, the girl pleaded with her stepfather not to shoot her. "I begged him, don't shoot me, don't shoot me, don't shoot me." But Jason Kenny shot her anyway. The bullet struck her in the face. Another hit her shoulder. She fell bleeding in a home that had become, in the course of a single horrifying night, a crime scene. And then Jason Kenny fled. He got into his vehicle and drove away from Lakeland, away from the house with the Christmas lights, away from the woman he had killed and the child he had shot and the infant daughter he had left sleeping, untouched, in her crib. In what might be the most haunting detail of the entire case, as he drove through the darkness of a Florida December night, Jason Kenney called his sister. Perhaps it was guilt. Perhaps it was the alcohol wearing thin, reality flooding in. Whatever it was, he told her he had done something very, very bad. And then he said something that carried the weight of a man who had already made his final decision. "The next time you see me will be on the news." He drove to Lake Wales, a town not far from Lakeland, to the home where his late father had once lived. It was a place of old memory, perhaps a place of some private meaning to him. He pulled in and walked to the shed on that property, a shed not unlike the one behind his own home, where he had spent the earlier hours of the night drinking, watching football, preparing, without knowing it, for what was to come. He barricaded himself inside. Law enforcement had already converged on the scene in Lakeland. The 911 call placed by the 12-year-old boy had brought deputies racing to the house. What they found was devastating. Crystal dead, her teenage daughter shot and critical, and a 1-year-old girl sleeping peacefully in her crib, entirely unaware that her mother was gone. The baby's survival would later be called the mercy of that terrible night, but it came alongside losses so profound that mercy barely seemed adequate as a word. Sheriff Judd, a man whose decades in law enforcement had prepared him for the worst human beings could do to each other, stood before reporters in the days that followed and spoke about the case with a directness that cut through the usual carefully crafted language of official statements. He confirmed that deputies had tracked Jason Kenney to his late father's property in Lake Wales. They surrounded the shed. They knew he was inside. What followed was the final act of a night that had already consumed so much. A single gunshot rang out from inside the shed. When deputies entered, they found Jason Kenney dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. He was 47 years old. In the days following the tragedy, the 13-year-old girl who had been shot in the face and shoulder was transported to a nearby hospital. Doctors worked to stabilize her. Sheriff Judd called her survival a Christmas miracle, and the phrase, though it might sound hollow in the shadow of so much grief, was earned. She had been shot twice at close range by a man who intended to kill her. That she survived was not just fortunate, it was extraordinary. She was also brave. In the hours and days after the shooting, as investigators pieced together the timeline of that night, she spoke to them. She answered their questions with a courage that belied her age and the trauma she had endured. Her words, "I begged him, don't shoot me, don't shoot me, don't shoot me, and he shot me anyway," would become one of the most searing testimonies of the case, a statement that needed no embellishment or interpretation. In the investigation that followed, authorities confirmed that Jason Kenney had no prior criminal record. He was not a man with a history of documented violence, not someone the system had flagged, not someone who had cycled through courtrooms or jail cells. He was a 47-year-old man whose descent had been largely invisible to the outside world, contained within the walls of a home and the private correspondence of a wife who had tried to address it on her own. That letter, Crystal's letter, the one about drinking and drugs and God, became one of the most discussed elements of the case as it gained national attention. It was not a legal document or a formal complaint. It was a wife's private communication to a husband, written in the hope that love might accomplish what she feared confrontation alone could not. It was, in retrospect, evidence that Crystal Kenney had seen the danger clearly, had named it, had tried to address it through both faith and directness. It was also evidence that the resources available to her, the warnings she could give, the words she could write, the prayers she could offer, were not enough to prevent what happened. This is one of the deeper truths that the Kenney case holds, beyond the immediate horror of a single night. It speaks to the particular invisibility of domestic situations in which the warning signs exist but are private, in which the suffering is real but contained, in which no formal system has yet been triggered. Crystal had not called the police before that night. The system had no file on Jason Kenney. And so when the escalation came, sudden, alcohol-fueled, irreversible, there was no safety net already in place, no protocol already running, no intervention already underway. The community in Lakeland, and then the wider country, reacted with a grief that was also, in part, a reckoning. The case spread rapidly across social media and news networks, not because it was unprecedented. Domestic violence claims lives in America with devastating regularity, but because of its particular elements. The Christmas timing, the football game as a catalyst, the bravery of the 12-year-old boy who ran for help, the survival of a teenager shot in the face, the baby asleep in the crib. Sheriff Judd, in one of his press conference statements, said of Jason Kenney with plain-spoken directness, "The only right thing he did that night was to take his own life after what he had done." It was a blunt assessment, and it reflected the depth of the community's anger and grief. This was not a case that invited extended contemplation of the perpetrator's psychology. Jason Kenney had made choices, to drink, to arm himself, to escalate, to shoot, and those choices had killed a woman of faith and love, had nearly killed a 13-year-old girl whose only crime was being present, and had left a 1-year-old without her mother. For Crystal's family, the weeks that followed the shooting were an immersion in grief that had no clean edges. They were mourning a woman who had loved generously and been failed by the man she trusted. They were also watching over a teenager who was recovering from gunshot wounds to the face, navigating a trauma whose echoes would extend far beyond the physical. And they were caring for an infant who would grow up with no memory of her mother's face, only photographs, only stories, only the letter Crystal once wrote, full of love and warning, to a man who had not listened. The case of Jason Kenney became, in the days around Christmas 2025, a story that the country held collectively. A story of what is lost when rage meets access to a weapon, when alcohol dismantles whatever restraint might otherwise have held, when the private suffering of a household goes unseen until it explodes into a night of irreversible violence. It was a story about children who were asked, in the space of one ordinary December evening, to carry things no child should ever have to carry. A 12-year-old who ran at his mother's command and heard the gunshot behind him. A 13-year-old who begged for her life and did not receive mercy. A baby who slept through it all. Crystal Kenney had written that her family was not the way it should be. She had been right, and she had tried, in every way available to her, to change that. She had written the letter. She had sent her son for help. She had done everything a person can do within the limits of hope and love and the faith that people can choose better. That she was not saved by those efforts is not a failure of her will or her love. It is a testament to how quickly certain situations can move beyond the reach of hope, and how permanent the consequences can be when they do. In Lakeland, in the days after Christmas, people continued to hang their lights and exchange their gifts. Life moved forward the way it always does, with or without permission. But in one house on one street, there were children who had survived the unsurvivable, and a family that would spend the rest of their lives understanding what they had lost, and honoring, in whatever ways they could, the woman who had loved them enough to make sure, even in her final moments, that her son got out alive. Crystal Kenney had needed God that night. What arrived instead were deputies, a hospital, and the quiet miracle of a girl who somehow, impossibly, lived to speak her truth. Story 3. The love that exists between twin sisters, something beyond ordinary sibling attachment, a bond woven from identical beginnings, from shared bedrooms and shared memories, and the wordless understanding that comes from having entered the world at the same moment, side by side. Jennifer and Christina Beard had that kind of love. They had grown up together through the turbulence of a childhood, shaped by a mother whose charm was as powerful as it was unstable, and they had held on to each other through the years when holding on required something close to courage. In the spring of 2000, that courage would be tested in a way that neither of them could have prepared for. Not by a stranger, not by an accident of fate, but by the woman who had given them life. Their story is not just the story of a murder. It is the story of what two daughters had to choose between. A mother they loved and the truth they could not unknow. Their mother, Celeste Beard. She had grown up in difficult circumstances, had lived through early marriages that unraveled, and had carried with her through all of it a quality that people who knew her described in contradictory terms. She was magnetic and manipulative, warm and calculating, capable of making a person feel like the only one in the room, and then discarding them when they were no longer useful. She had a gift for presenting herself as whatever the moment required. By the late 1990s, that gift had found its fullest expression in her relationship with Stephen Beard. Stephen Beard was 75 years old, a self-made millionaire, a former television executive whose career had earned him both wealth and standing in the communities around Austin, Texas. He was decades older than Celeste, a fact that many people noticed and that some found troubling, though Stephen himself seemed to want nothing more than to share what he had built with a woman who filled the quiet rooms of his Westlake Hills home with energy and life. They married in 1995. Stephen had children from a previous marriage, and Celeste came to the union with twin daughters, Jennifer and Christina, who had been teenagers when the family was assembled. Stephen grew genuinely fond of the girls. He included them in his will alongside his own biological children, treating them with a generosity that reflected the kind of man he was. His home was their home. His estate was part of their future. But behind the doors of the Westlake Hills house, the marriage between Celeste and Stephen was something more complicated than it appeared from outside. Celeste spent freely. Stephen's money flowed through her hands and into clothes, gifts, travel, and pleasures that accumulated into a pattern her husband found troubling. Arguments about finances grew in frequency and bitterness. Stephen had begun to contemplate divorce for a woman whose financial existence depended entirely on the continuation of that marriage. Divorce was not simply a painful prospect. It was, in the most practical sense, a catastrophe. It was during a period of personal instability in 1998 that Celeste checked herself into St. David's Pavilion, a mental health facility in Austin. She had been struggling, she said, with depression. It was there, in the careful, contained world of a psychiatric facility, that she met a woman named Tracy Tarleton. Tracy was a bookstore manager, quiet, intense, and as time would reveal, extraordinarily susceptible to the particular kind of influence that Celeste had always known how to wield. They became friends. They had dinner. They spent time together. And somewhere in the evolution of that friendship, something deeper, more dangerous, began to develop. A romantic attachment that Tracy felt with a depth that Celeste would learn to use as a lever. Celeste made clear from early on that a physical relationship between them would only become possible under one condition. Stephen Beard had to die. Whether Tracy believed her, whether she tried to convince herself Celeste did not mean it, whether she told herself that love was the reason, and everything else was just words on the afternoon of Friday, October 1st, 1999, Tracy Tarleton met Celeste at the Beard residence. Celeste walked her through it all. Where to park, how to enter the house, where Stephen slept, where the bedroom was. She told Tracy that Jennifer would be away from the house that night, but that she and Christina would be at home, in another bedroom. 2 nights later, on October 3rd, 1999, Tracy Tarleton entered the Westlake Hills home in the early hours of the morning, walked to the bedroom where Stephen Beard lay sleeping, and shot him in the abdomen with a 20-gauge shotgun. Stephen did not die immediately. He was 75 years old and had been shot in the stomach while he slept, and yet the man who had built his fortune from effort and determination summoned that same quality in the weeks that followed. He was found by first responders still holding his side. Celeste and Christina, as planned, were in another bedroom of the house at the time of the shooting. They followed Stephen to the hospital. At the hospital, a police officer named Paul Knight spoke to the young people who had gathered there and asked if they knew who might have shot him. Jennifer and Christina, who had seen and heard things they did not yet fully understand, almost immediately named Tracy Tarleton, their mother's friend, the woman who called the house too often, whose presence in their lives had always felt slightly off balance. They pointed without hesitation in the right direction. Tracy Tarleton was arrested 6 days after the shooting, found at her home with a 20-gauge shotgun shell and the very bullet that had wounded Stephen recovered in a search of her property. But detectives, from the earliest days of the investigation, had a nagging sense that the picture was incomplete. Tracy had no clear motive to shoot Stephen Beard. She barely knew him. The forensic evidence placed her at the scene, but the human logic of the crime, the why of it, pointed elsewhere. They began to look harder at Celeste. They noted that Celeste, at the hospital where her husband lay in intensive care, had been observed crying without tears, performing grief without quite inhabiting it. They heard from people who had been around the couple that Stephen had been discussing the possibility of divorce. They began to build a case not against the woman who had pulled the trigger, but against the woman who had aimed it. Stephen Beard, meanwhile, fought. He was moved from intensive care to a regular room. He improved slowly and was eventually sent home. But home, in the weeks that followed, was itself a dangerous place. Christina would later tell that Celeste took every opportunity she could to speed it along after Stephen returned from the hospital. Christina described her mother changing Stephen's wounds with unwashed hands, a detail so clinical in its horror that it is difficult to hold in mind. But the pattern that Christina was observing from inside the house, day after day, was one of a wife whose interest in her husband's recovery fell far short of what recovery required. On January 22, 2000, Stephen Beard died. The official cause was a blood clot, a complication traced to the shotgun wound he had survived for nearly 4 months. He was 76 years old. Celeste became his widow. The will that Stephen had written, the one that included Celeste alongside his children and Celeste's daughters, now moved from a document about the future to a document about the present. The money was real. The inheritance was waiting. And Celeste, according to the picture investigators were assembling, had known exactly what she was doing from the beginning. Tracy Tarleton had been charged with assault, the charge that had been filed in the immediate aftermath of the shooting when prosecutors did not yet have the full picture. As her own case moved toward trial, something shifted inside her. She had been carrying the weight of what Celeste had asked her to do and what she had agreed to, and the structure she had built to bear that weight began to crack. Before her trial, she contacted prosecutors. She told them the truth. She told them about Celeste, about the mental health facility, the friendship, the relationship, the conditions Celeste had placed on love, the October 1st walkthrough of the house, the parking instructions, the bedroom directions, the plan. Everything. Tracy Tarleton confessed to shooting Stephen Beard and named Celeste as the architect of his death. In exchange, she pleaded guilty to murder and was sentenced to 20 years. She would become, for the prosecution, the linchpin witness at Celeste's eventual trial. But Tracy's testimony alone, the word of a convicted murderer against the woman she claimed to have loved, might not be enough. Prosecutors needed corroboration, and it was here, in the months between Stephen's death and Celeste's eventual arrest, that Christina Beard made a decision that would define everything that followed. Christina had been watching her mother with the raw, open eyes of a daughter who desperately wanted to find a different explanation for what she was seeing. She had watched her mother not cry real tears at the hospital. She had watched the bandage changes. She had listened to her mother's phone calls, heard the things Celeste said in unguarded moments, and felt the understanding building in her chest like pressure that had nowhere to go. In April 2000, weeks after Stephen's death, Christina Beard began to record her mother's phone calls. She had a phone. She had the will to use it. And Celeste, who believed that her daughters were in her orbit, subject to her control, spoke freely. What Christina captured on those recordings was the evidence that would ultimately seal her mother's fate. In one call, Celeste could be heard screaming about Tracy Tarleton, not with the grief of a woman whose friend had betrayed her, but with the fury of someone who felt that a tool she had used was now turning against her. And in that fury, Celeste said the words that would be played in a courtroom in front of a jury 2 years later. I hired somebody to kill Tracy. Not the words of an innocent woman. Not the words of someone who had been victimized by an obsessive friend. The words of someone who employed, who directed, who planned. By April 2000, Christina and Jennifer were in an almost unimaginably dangerous position. Their mother had become aware that the investigation was circling closer. She knew the girls had spoken to police. She knew Christina had been recording calls. And the woman who had arranged for a man to be shot while he slept was now, according to investigators and the twins themselves, suggesting that the problem of her daughters might need to be resolved. There came a day in April 2000 when Christina, in a conversation with her mother that she later described with barely contained horror, heard something that made her blood run cold. She was not certain that her own life was safe. She asked her sister a question that no daughter should ever have to ask. Am I going in this casket soon? The twins made their decision. They went to law enforcement and handed over the recordings. They did not do it lightly, and the record does not suggest they did it without grief. These were not women who had always been estranged from their mother, who had long since decided she was a monster. They were daughters who had wanted, for as long as they could remember, to have the kind of mother that other people had. They had grown up with Celeste, had lived through her moods and her marriages, had come to the Beard household as teenagers, and watched a man they cared for be shot in his own bed. And now they were handing the most damning evidence available to the people trying to put their mother in prison for the rest of her life. After handing over the recordings, the twins were told to leave, that their safety could not be guaranteed if they remained within reach of Celeste. They had 6 hours. 6 hours to collect what they needed and disappear before word of what they had done could travel back to their mother. The specificity of that timeline, the urgency of it, the way it transforms what might otherwise be an act of civic duty into something that feels like a desperate flight, says everything about what those 2 young women faced in the spring of 2000. They were not simply cooperating with a murder investigation. They were fleeing the aftermath of that cooperation, running from the possibility that their mother's reach extended further than the law could immediately contain. With Tracy Tarleton's confession and the audio recordings in hand, detectives and prosecutors finally had what they needed. On March 28, 2002, Celeste Beard Johnson was arrested and charged with capital murder. By that point, she had moved on considerably from the years of her marriage to Stephen. She had married a man named Cole Johnson. She was living a different version of her reconstructed life, and the legal proceedings that were about to begin would pull all of it apart. The trial opened in 2003. The prosecution presented the phone recordings, Tracy's testimony, the cell phone records, the statements of witnesses who described Celeste's tearless hospital performance, and the testimony of both Christina and Jennifer themselves. Celeste's defense attorney, Dick DeGuerin, one of the most respected criminal defense lawyers in Texas, built his case on several pillars. He argued that Tracy Tarleton had acted alone, driven by an obsession with Celeste that had tipped into violence. He argued that Celeste had not encouraged or directed Tracy in any meaningful sense, that Tracy's claim of a romantic relationship and a murderous agreement was the invention of an unstable mind that DeGuerin described as thoroughly unreliable. And he attacked the daughters with a directness that was difficult to sit through. He argued that Jennifer and Christina had testified against their mother because they were greedy and manipulative, because their mother's conviction guaranteed them a share of an inheritance that they would lose if she were acquitted. He told the jury that the girls had lied on the stand. But the jury listened to everything: the recordings, the confession, the timeline, the torn-apart marriage, the financial desperation, the tears that weren't tears. And on the question of what had happened to Stephen Beard and who had wanted it to happen, they reached their conclusion. The verdict was delivered, guilty of capital murder. Celeste Beard Johnson was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. She would spend the rest of her life at the Lane Murray Correctional Facility in Gatesville, Texas, in a maximum security housing unit, separated from the world she had tried so hard to control. Tracy Tarleton was released from prison in 2010 after serving 10 years of her 20-year sentence. The girls, Jennifer and Christina, rebuilt their lives in the years after the trial, carrying with them the particular weight of having done what they did. Christina, who later went by Christina Fritz, raised her own children, and in interviews described what it meant to give her own children the kind of maternal presence she had always wanted for herself. Her mother's conviction did not give her back a mother. It gave her something colder and more durable, the knowledge that she had told the truth when the truth was the hardest possible thing to tell, and that the man who had loved her and her sister with the uncomplicated warmth of a stepfather deserved nothing less. Stephen Beard was shot in his own bed while he was asleep, a man of 75 who had worked his whole life to build something real, who had opened his home and his will and his affection to a woman who had already decided what she needed him to be worth. He survived that shot for 4 months, fighting with the stubbornness of someone who is not ready to stop living. He ultimately lost that fight. The justice that followed his death took years to arrive and required 2 of the people who loved him most to stand in a courtroom and speak against their own mother. That is the particular cost of this case, not just the crime itself, but what the crime demanded of the people left standing in its wake, and the courage it took for 2 daughters to ensure that the silence their mother had counted on never came. Story 4. Aurora, Colorado is the kind of city that sprawls quietly east of Denver like a long exhale. Wide streets lined with strip malls and apartment complexes, neighborhoods of modest family homes where lawns blend into one another, and the Rocky Mountains rise blue and distant on the western horizon. In the warm late days of August 2013, nothing about the neighborhood near East Yale Avenue and Parker Road looked different from any other part of that quietly ordinary city. The houses sat behind their driveways. The streets went about their business. Families moved through their evenings in the invisible way families do, their internal lives hidden behind closed doors and drawn curtains. And behind one of those doors, in the bathroom of a home that a woman named Tyiana Matheni had tried her best to keep together, something was building, a storm of a kind that no one in that neighborhood, perhaps no one who loved the people inside that house, could fully see until it had already become irreversible. Tyiana Matheni was 47 years old in the summer of 2013. She had built her life with the kind of steady, patient effort that goes largely unnoticed until it is gone. A woman who worked, who tried, who kept the household running with the quiet competence of someone accustomed to carrying weight without complaint. She was a mother. She had a daughter, Isabella Guzman, who was 18 that summer, old enough to drive and vote and be held responsible for her choices by the world, but young enough that her mother still worried about her, still tried to intervene in her life, still picked up the phone when she was frightened by what she saw. She had a husband, Isabella's stepfather, who was a steady presence in the home, a man who went about his evenings in the way a person does when the household is functioning, when there is no reason to expect that an ordinary Tuesday in August will become something that cannot be undone. Isabella had been struggling for some time before August 2013, though the nature of that struggle was not yet fully understood by anyone around her. In the weeks leading up to the end of August, approximately a month before everything collapsed, something began to shift inside her mind in ways that she herself did not have the framework to interpret. She began hearing voices. Not the vague, indistinct noise of ordinary stress or anxiety, but voices that spoke to her with what felt, inside her deteriorating perception, like purpose and clarity. The world as she had known it began to reorganize itself around a reality that existed only in the fractures of her mind. She began to believe things, not as metaphor, not as passing dark thought, but as genuine, urgent conviction, that pointed her toward violence with the terrible logic of a mind that had lost its purchase on what was real. Isabella came to believe that she needed to kill her mother in order to save the world. The belief was not hers in any meaningful sense. It belonged to the illness, to the paranoid schizophrenia that was flooding her mind with hallucinations and delusions so powerful that they displaced ordinary reality entirely. She did not see her mother when she looked at the woman who had raised her. She saw, in the grip of her psychosis, a figure she had named Cecilia, a different person, a threat, a target designated by the voices and visions that had commandeered her consciousness. She could not separate Cecilia from Tyiana Matheni. She could not see through the hallucination to the woman underneath it. This is perhaps the most devastating detail in the entire case, that in the moment when everything happened, Isabella Guzman did not know she was killing her mother. But the events of August 28, 2013 did not begin in the bathroom. They began with a phone call. Tyiana Matheni, who had been watching her daughter's behavior with growing alarm, watching the mood shifts, the strange silences, the moments of inexplicable rage that seemed to come from somewhere outside normal human emotion, called the police. She was frightened. She wanted help understanding what was happening in her own home, and she turned, as people do when they do not know where else to turn, to the authorities. An officer responded and came to the house on East Yale Avenue. He spoke to Isabella. He told her that her mother had the right to ask her to leave the home if her behavior continued. He tried, in the language of de-escalation, to address what appeared from the outside to be a conflict between a mother and a difficult daughter. The police officer saw what was visible. He could not see what was happening inside Isabella's mind. After the officer left, things appeared to calm. Tyiana Matheni presumably felt the particular, exhausted relief that parents feel when an intervention seems to have diffused a crisis. Isabella appeared to settle. The evening moved forward. Tyiana Matheni went upstairs to take a shower, the most ordinary act imaginable, the end-of-day ritual of a woman who had been through a stressful afternoon, and was seeking the simple restoration of warm water and a few quiet minutes alone. She walked into the bathroom. She closed the door. She had no reason to believe that what was coming was already on its way. The day before, on August 27th, Isabella had sent her mother an email. The message was short and carried a weight that, in retrospect, reads as a warning the world was not equipped to correctly interpret. You will pay. The following morning, the day of the police call, she had spat in her mother's face. A gesture of contempt so raw and so unlike anything in the ordinary register of a parent-child conflict that it should have signaled, to everyone who witnessed or heard of it, that something was profoundly, clinically wrong. But in the confused space between recognizing a mental health crisis and having the tools to respond to one, the signals were received without being properly understood. That evening, in the upstairs bathroom of the family home, Isabella Guzman locked herself and her mother in together. Her stepfather was downstairs. What happened next reached him through the ceiling, sound traveling through the floor above him in a way that made no sense at first. The kind of sound that the brain initially refuses to categorize correctly because the correct categorization is too terrible to form. He heard a thump. He heard something wrong. He ran upstairs. When he pushed open the bathroom door and saw what was inside, he saw his wife on the floor. He saw Isabella standing over her, holding a knife. And he saw blood in a quantity and distribution that said, without any possibility of misunderstanding, that what had happened in that bathroom was final. Yin Hai Moi had been stabbed 79 times. The wounds were concentrated in her face, neck, and torso. She had also been struck with a baseball bat before the stabbing began. Forensic examination of the scene would reveal the full extent of what had occurred in that locked bathroom, and the numbers, 79 stab wounds, the concentration of injury in the most vulnerable and exposed parts of a human body, told a story of violence so sustained and so overwhelming that even trained investigators, who encounter violence as a professional reality, described what they found in the Guzman Moi household as among the most disturbing scenes they had encountered. Yin Hai Moi was 47 years old. She had called the police earlier that same day because she was worried about her daughter. Isabella Guzman fled the home. Her stepfather called 911. The police who had been at the house earlier that same afternoon were now dispatched to it again, this time as the first responders to a homicide. Investigators arrived. The neighborhood that had gone about its quiet Tuesday evening now found itself organized around a crime scene. The ordinary world pressing up against something unordinary with the disorientation that always accompanies violence in places built for domesticity. Isabella was not there. She had run into the August night, carrying with her whatever her fractured mind was making of what had just occurred. She was found and arrested the following day. In the days immediately following her arrest, Isabella Guzman appeared in court. Her court appearances, the way she looked at the cameras, the expressions that crossed her face, would eventually become one of the most discussed and debated elements of the case. People watching her in court saw a young woman who appeared, in moments, to smile. They saw someone who did not carry herself with the visible anguish that a person who understood what they had done might be expected to carry. What the cameras captured was a young woman whose perception of reality was still, at that point, profoundly disrupted. The smile was not the smile of someone who had done something and felt no remorse. It was, investigators and doctors would conclude, the behavior of someone who did not yet fully inhabit the reality that everyone else was standing in. She was formally charged with first-degree murder and 2 counts of crime of violence. On September 5, 2013, when she was due to appear in court for those formal charges, she refused to leave her jail cell at the Arapahoe County Detention Center. Court officials had to wait. The filing of charges was delayed not because of legal strategy, but because a young woman in a jail cell could not or would not come out. That detail, small and procedural in its context, added itself quietly to the growing picture of someone whose mental state was deeply disordered. In the weeks and months that followed, Isabella Guzman underwent comprehensive psychiatric evaluation. The results were unambiguous. A state doctor testified that she was suffering from paranoid schizophrenia, that she hallucinated, stared into space, had conversations with people who were not present. More significantly, the doctor testified that approximately a month before the killing, Isabella had begun hearing voices and had developed the specific, consuming delusion that she needed to kill her mother in order to save the world. She had not known, in the grip of that delusion, that she was killing her mother. She had believed she was killing Cecilia, the figure her fractured mind had placed in her mother's body, a threat designated for elimination by forces that felt, to her, absolutely real. After just a few weeks on psychiatric medication, the doctor noted, Isabella's condition improved dramatically. The delusions retreated, the hallucinations became quieter, and in the space left behind by the illness, the reality of what had happened in that bathroom on East Yale Avenue began to come into focus. The legal proceedings that followed were, by the standards of a first-degree murder case, unusually straightforward. The evidence of Isabella's mental illness was not in dispute. The district attorney of Arapahoe County reviewed the psychiatric evaluations and made a decision that was as honest as it was unusual. He conceded that the evidence was clear, that Isabella Guzman had been insane at the time she killed her mother, and that pursuing a murder conviction against a profoundly psychotic 18-year-old would not serve the interests of justice. Chief Deputy District Attorney Tomsic stood before the court and stated plainly, "We are conceding that the defendant was insane at the time. There would be no trial. There would be no jury deliberating on guilt or innocence. There would only be a judge reviewing the psychiatric evidence and making the determination that the law required." On June 25, 2014, in a Centennial, Colorado courtroom, Judge Craig Loper reviewed the results of Isabella's mental evaluation and issued his ruling. Isabella Guzman was found not guilty by reason of insanity. She was not acquitted. Not guilty by reason of insanity is not the same as innocence. It is a legal finding that acknowledges the act while determining that the person who committed it lacked the mental capacity to understand what they were doing or to understand that it was wrong. The judge immediately committed her to the Colorado Mental Health Institute at Pueblo, a state psychiatric facility, for an indefinite term, to be held until she was deemed no longer a threat to the public or to herself. The duration of that commitment had no fixed end point. She would stay until the state decided, based on her mental state and ongoing evaluation, that she was ready. The Colorado Mental Health Institute at Pueblo sits in the broad southern plains of Colorado, far from the Denver suburbs where the crime had occurred. It is a secure facility, a place where treatment and containment exist alongside each other, where the daily routines of medication and therapy and assessment replace the freedoms of ordinary life. Isabella Guzman arrived there as a 19-year-old woman who, in the months since the killing, had been placed on antipsychotic medication and had begun the slow, difficult process of understanding what had happened. That process, coming back to reality and finding, inside that reality, the knowledge of what you did, is perhaps the most painful dimension of severe psychotic illness. The violence of August 28, 2013, had been committed by a mind that was not functioning. The grief and horror of confronting it belonged to a mind that was. She remained in the institute through the years that followed. In November 2020, 7 years after the killing, Isabella Guzman launched a formal effort to be released. She told that she was on medication, that her sanity had been restored, and that she was ready to return to society. She also, in the same set of statements, made allegations that she had suffered years of abuse at the hands of her family, claims that added a layer of complexity and pain to an already deeply complex case, and that were noted by her attorneys as context for understanding her mental state in the years leading up to August 2013. Whether those allegations are borne out by independent evidence remains part of the ongoing record of her case. In June 2021, a Colorado court ruled that Isabella would be allowed to leave the state hospital for certain supervised activities, a partial, conditional step toward the world outside the facility, contingent on continued treatment compliance and ongoing evaluation. The decision was not a release. It was an incremental opening, the kind of cautious, supervised movement that a system designed to balance individual rights against public safety makes when the evidence supports it, but certainty remains beyond reach. As of the time of her most recent public petitions, Isabella Guzman remained at the Colorado Mental Health Institute in Pueblo, committed under the finding of not guilty by reason of insanity, held within the psychiatric care system with no fixed date of release, and no certainty about when the evaluations that govern her future would arrive at the conclusion she was asking for. Yun Hai Moi was 47 years old on August 28, 2013. She is described in the records available about her life primarily through her role as a mother, as the woman who made the call, who went upstairs for a shower, who was found by her husband on a bathroom floor. She deserves more than that. She was a person who had lived long enough to build a home, maintain a job, raise a daughter, and worry about that daughter's behavior enough to dial the police. She was someone whose last day on earth was spent trying to manage a situation she did not fully understand, and who went upstairs in the evening of that day in the ordinary expectation that she would come back down. She was a mother, and the case that would carry her daughter's name, not hers, began in the bathroom where she died, a room from which she never emerged, and which the rest of the world has spent more than a decade trying to fully comprehend. Story 5. The morning of August 21st, 2017 arrived over Farmington Hills, Michigan with the quiet dignity of late summer. The kind of morning that has not yet decided between warmth and crispness, where the air carries the faint suggestion of autumn without quite surrendering the heat. In the wealthy neighborhoods of Oakland County, the streets were still, the large homes set back behind manicured lawns, their windows catching the early light in the way that expensive glass always does. Cleanly, perfectly, without flaw. It was a Monday. Children were preparing for the school year that was still weeks away. Families were settling into the last rhythms of summer. Inside a sprawling 10,000-square-foot mansion on one of those quiet streets, 14-year-old Nata Alantawi was doing what teenagers do on ordinary mornings, moving through the house in the unhurried way of someone who has not yet learned that ordinary moments are a gift. Her mother, Nata Alantawi, was 35 years old, dark-haired, and quietly beautiful in the way that comes from discipline and self-care. A certified fitness instructor, she had built a body and a routine around strength, and she had poured that same quality, her fierce, persistent strength, into the project of being a mother. She had 3 children, Aya, 16-year-old Muhammad, and a younger child. She had come to America with the quiet ambition of someone who understood what opportunity could mean, and she had built, in Farmington Hills, what looked from the outside like a successful and comfortable life. That morning, Aya went looking for her mother. She found her in the backyard, on the patio below a second-story window. The window above was open. On the patio beside Nada's body lay a wet rag. In the guest room just inside that open window, a ladder leaned against the wall, with a bottle of Tilex cleaning spray perched upon it. The scene presented itself with the appearance of a terrible accident. A woman who had woken early to clean a window, who had reached too far, lost her balance, and fallen. Aya's scream changed everything. The emergency services that responded to the call found a 14-year-old girl standing over the body of her mother, and a scene arranged with a precision that, in the first panicked moments, looked like tragedy. Detectives and forensic investigators moved through the large house carefully. They noted the open window. They noted the cleaning supplies. They noted the absence of anything that immediately contradicted the story the scene was telling. Farmington Hills police were thorough, and they were not yet convinced. But the story seemed possible. A woman cleaning windows. An accident. A terrible, irreversible accident. But the body told a different story. When Dr. Ljubisa J. Dragovic, the medical examiner from the Oakland County Medical Examiner's Office, performed the autopsy on Nata Alantawi, he made a determination that stopped the investigation in its tracks and redirected it entirely. Nata Alantawi had not died from her fall. She had been dead before she ever left that window. The cause of death was asphyxiation, nasal and oral blockage, consistent with someone having pressed a pillow or cloth over her face and held it there until she could no longer breathe. There was also blunt force head trauma, and there on her lower lip was a bruise that had been inflicted before she died. A second medical examiner, Dr. Ruben Ortiz Reyes, later testified in court to the same findings, that the evidence found in her lungs indicated she had died of suffocation before the fall, that her body had been carried to that window and dropped deliberately. The cleaning supplies, the wet rag, the spray marks on the glass, the latter positioned just so. None of it was the remnant of an accident. All of it was the architecture of a cover story assembled with cold and calculated intention. Investigators immediately turned to the security cameras mounted around the property. There were 6 of them. The house was enormous, and the cameras had been installed to monitor its perimeter. This was, in theory, a detail that should have helped the perpetrator. A house equipped with a sophisticated security system spoke of a family that valued its privacy and control. But in the way that certain careful plans reveal their fatal flaw only after the fact, the cameras had not all been disabled. Most were not recording the interior of the home that morning. But one of them, just one, positioned at an angle that fate alone seemed to have chosen, was recording the exterior at the precise moment that mattered. What it captured was not a woman falling out of a window while cleaning. What it captured was a body, a lifeless form being hauled up and through the frame of that second-story window, and then dropping to the patio below. The footage was not high definition. It was not perfectly lit, but it was unmistakable in what it showed. In the shadows just inside the window, the shape of a person with short hair, lifting something heavy, something that had no resistance, no movement of its own, and releasing it through the opening. Dr. Dragovic watched this footage and said publicly and in court what it had made him feel. I said, "God, this cannot be. You see the lifeless body being disposed over the window sill." The question that remained, the question that would drive the next months and years of investigation and legal proceedings, was not whether Nata Alantawi had been murdered. The science and the footage together had settled that beyond reasonable doubt. The question was who had done it. The first instinct of many who knew the family pointed in a direction that seemed, given the history, entirely logical. Nata Alantawi was in the process of divorcing her husband, Basil Alantawi. The marriage had not been peaceful. Basil had a documented history of domestic violence toward Nata, serious enough that he had been charged, convicted, and placed on probation. At the time of Nata's death, he was not just under supervision from the court. He was wearing an electronic tracking device that monitored his location at all times, and the device placed him miles away from the house that morning. Basil Alantawi's alibi was not a claim or an assertion. It was a technological record, a continuous stream of GPS data that could not be altered and could not lie. Whatever happened inside that 10,000 square foot home on the morning of August 21st, 2017, Basil Alantawi had not been there to do it. Investigators accepted this evidence and turned their attention to the other occupants of the house. Aya had found the body. She was 14. She had no history of violence, no physical capacity consistent with hauling an adult woman's body across a room and through a window, and no apparent motive that investigators could identify. The surveillance footage had shown a figure with short hair. Aya had long hair. That left Muhammad. Muhammad Alantawi was 16 years old in August 2017. He was tall enough, strong enough, and physically capable of doing what the footage appeared to show. He had short hair. He was the only male present in the house that morning. And as investigators began to look more closely at the domestic situation inside the Alantawi home, they found something that transformed the case from a mystery into a tragedy of almost unbearable dimensions. Muhammad had taken his father's side in the divorce. Nata Alantawi had made the decision to leave Basil Alantawi. It was, by any reasonable assessment, a decision born of self-preservation. A woman with documented evidence of abuse, with a legal case already established, choosing to remove herself and her children from a dangerous situation. The divorce proceedings were underway, and Nata was scheduled to give a deposition, formal, legally binding testimony, in the coming days. Her testimony was expected to be damaging to Basil's position in the case, and potentially relevant to other legal proceedings Basil was facing. Muhammad saw the divorce not as his mother's attempt to protect herself, but as her attempt to destroy the family. He had watched his parents' marriage deteriorate, had seen his father charged and placed on probation, and had arrived, through whatever combination of age, loyalty, and influence, at a conclusion that placed all blame on his mother. His sister Aya testified in court, describing her brother's state of mind in the months before their mother's death. When the divorce case started, he was very against it because he had kind of saw it as my mother was trying to take my father's money, my father's house, destroy our family, rip our family apart, she said. In his phone, Muhammad had saved his mother's contact under a single, devastating word. Not mom. Not mother. Not even her name. He had listed her as Dog. When detectives first interviewed Muhammad after Nata's body was found, he denied everything with the confident deflection of someone who believed the scene he had staged was convincing enough to hold. He had not been with his mother that morning. He knew nothing about what had happened. He was shocked, grieved, mystified by her death. Then investigators pressed again, gently, professionally, with the practiced patience of interrogators who know that cracks appear in stories when they are pressed repeatedly from different angles. They asked him whether perhaps he had been with her, helping her clean, holding the ladder, maybe present when she fell. Muhammad's story shifted. He admitted he had seen his mother that morning. He had given her the cleaning spray, he said. He had been nearby. And then, in the iteration that investigators knew could not be true, because the medical examiner had already confirmed that Nata was dead before she fell, he claimed he had been holding the ladder when she toppled out of the window. A woman who was dead before she fell does not topple accidentally from ladders. A body that shows signs of suffocation does not slip. The story Muhammad was telling was a story built for a different reality, one in which his mother had died from a fall, one in which the surveillance camera had captured nothing, one in which the medical examiner had found nothing unusual. None of those things were true, and investigators knew it. Muhammad Alantawi was arrested in connection with his mother's murder and charged with first-degree premeditated murder. He was 16 years old. The decision to charge him as an adult was made, and the legal proceedings that followed would stretch across nearly 5 years. An agonizing span of time for a family already torn apart in every direction imaginable. The investigation surfaced additional evidence that painted a picture of a young man who had moved toward this act not in a moment of blind rage, but with a degree of planning that made his age feel, to those watching the case, almost surreal. Prosecutors theorized that Muhammad had suffocated his mother, using a pillow or a cloth, perhaps soaked in something to accelerate her loss of consciousness, and then carried her body to the window and pushed her through it. The scene had been prepared before the act. The ladder placed inside, the cleaning spray positioned on it, the window opened, the rag already wet. This was not an impulsive response to a sudden confrontation. This was premeditation. The word carries its full weight here. And then there was the CPR. When emergency services arrived and first responders were attempting to revive Nata Alantawi, Muhammad was on the phone with the dispatcher, performing chest compressions while the dispatcher counted the rhythm. Investigators later reviewed the footage and made a finding that added another layer of calculated horror to the story. The footage showed Muhammad stopping his compressions, his hands lifting from his mother's chest, while his mouth continued to count the numbers out loud in time with the dispatcher's instructions. He was performing the performance of trying to save her while withholding the actual effort. Whether this detail was presented as evidence of guilt or simply of a mind that had already separated itself from the reality of what had happened, it sat in the courtroom when the jury heard it and refused to move quietly. The trial arrived in 2022, nearly 5 years after the morning Aya had found her mother on the patio. Muhammad Alantawi, now 21 years old, maintained his innocence throughout. He sat in a courtroom that also contained his sister, the same 14-year-old girl who had found their mother's body and who was now a young woman testifying against him, providing the jury with the words he had said about the divorce, the context of his anger, the motive that prosecutors had built their case upon. Prosecutors laid out the physical evidence methodically. The medical examiner's conclusions about asphyxiation preceding the fall, the bruise on Nata's lower lip, the blunt force trauma to her head, the shadow in the window captured on surveillance footage, a figure with short hair hoisting a lifeless body through a frame. They laid out the circumstances, Nata's upcoming deposition, the divorce that Muhammad believed was destroying his family, the contact name in his phone, the changing story he had told investigators in the hours after her death. They laid out the CPR footage. The jury deliberated for 2 hours. 2 hours, a span of time shorter than a full-length film. To weigh 5 years of investigation, multiple autopsy reports, surveillance footage, testimony from a daughter about her brother's state of mind, forensic pathology, and the changing stories of a young man who had offered investigators a different version of events each time they pressed. After 2 hours, they returned a verdict of guilty of first-degree premeditated murder. The sentencing hearing, held in September 2022 in an Oakland County courtroom, lasted 4 hours. Muhammad Alantawi, by this point, had chosen to represent himself, a decision that said something about the degree to which he remained, even after conviction, in a posture of resistance to the proceedings. He raised challenges and objections throughout the hearing. He claimed that the conviction had been the product of discrimination, that he had been found guilty not because of the evidence, but because he was Muslim and the son of Syrian immigrants. Judge Mary Ellen Brennan listened to all of it. She listened to Muhammad's objections. She listened to the family members who spoke. And then she sentenced him to 35 to 60 years in the Michigan Department of Corrections, describing the crime as heinous in a courtroom that had spent 4 hours absorbing the full weight of what had been done and what had been lost. As Muhammad was led out of the courtroom, a voice called after him. The words were short and final. "Have fun rotting in prison, murderer." The voice was his sister's. Aya Alantawi had been 14 years old when she found her mother's body on a summer morning in Farmington Hills. She had gone looking for Nata the way children look for their parents, without fear, without suspicion, with the easy confidence of someone who expects to find what they are looking for. She had found her on the patio instead, below an open window, next to a wet rag. She had screamed, and she had spent the next 5 years watching her family dissolve in the most complete and devastating way a family can dissolve. Her mother gone, her father having set the conditions for everything that followed, her brother arrested, charged, tried, convicted, and sentenced. She stood in that courtroom at the end of it and had no softness left to offer. Nata Alantawi had been trying to leave. That was the simplest and most important fact at the center of all of it. She had survived a marriage with a man who had been formally charged with domestic violence against her. She had navigated the legal system well enough to secure his probation and the electronic monitoring device that would ultimately alibi him from her murder. She was days away from giving a deposition that would formalize her departure, her testimony, her legal standing. She had done, step by careful step, what women in dangerous domestic situations are told to do. She had used the system. She had documented the abuse, she had sought legal protection, she had filed for divorce. And the danger had come not from outside that careful framework, but from within her own home. Not from a stranger, not from the man the tracking device had already eliminated. From her son, who had listened to someone or to something inside himself, and arrived at the conclusion that his mother's survival was less important than his father's assets, or his family's unity, or some version of loyalty that a 16-year-old had allowed to metastasize into something unrecognizable. These questions do not have clean answers. The case offers evidence and testimony and a verdict, but it does not offer the deeper kind of resolution that people search for when they try to understand how something like this happens. Muhammad Alantawi was convicted. He is in prison. The system processed the facts and rendered its judgment with the relative speed of 2 hours of deliberation. None of that restores what was taken. Nata Alantawi was 35 years old when she was killed. Young by any measure, a fitness instructor with strength and health and an evident determination to make her life better than it had been. She had 3 children. She had survived abuse and had done the brave, exhausting work of leaving. She had an upcoming deposition that was supposed to be the next step in that survival. Instead, her daughter found her on the backyard patio of their home on a quiet Monday morning in August, below an open window, beside a wet rag, in a scene that had been arranged specifically to look like something it was not. The surveillance cameras, the ones that the people in that house had apparently hoped were not recording, or had tried to disable, or had simply failed to account for fully, caught the shadow in the window. It was grainy. It was imperfect, but it was enough. It was enough to show, in the merciless language of recorded footage, what the medical examiner had already determined through science, that Nata Alantawi had not fallen. She had been carried, and she had been dropped, by someone who had once called her mother. Story 6. There is a kind of cruelty that wears the face of charm. It smiles when it should weep, flatters when it means harm, and arranges its victims neatly into the dark like objects rearranged on a shelf. In the winter of 2005, the city of Omaha, Nebraska, a place of wide streets, cold skies, and neighborhoods that hummed quietly through the night, became the stage for exactly that kind of cruelty. At the center of it stood a young woman from Arizona named Tyiana Matheni. a girl who had once dreamed of becoming a nurse, who had once believed that love meant safety, and who would spend one terrible week allowing herself to be shaped into something she could never entirely take back. She was born on October 19, 1983, and raised in Tucson, Arizona, a sun-drenched desert city far from the cold plains of Nebraska. By her early 20s, she was enrolled in nursing school, a choice that spoke to something nurturing within her, some desire to tend to the broken and the sick. But Tyiana also carried wounds of her own, wounds she had never fully learned to name. Her history included trauma, the kind that makes a person endlessly hungry for affection, susceptible to anyone who offers warmth without asking too many questions. That particular vulnerability, that need to be wanted, would prove to be the crack through which everything fell apart. It was at a party in Arizona that she first encountered Terry Sellers. He was 22, charismatic, and impossible to ignore. He carried himself with the confident ease of someone who believed the world owed him something, speaking in smooth, easy sentences that made him sound like a man who had everything figured out. He was an aspiring rapper, someone who talked about music and ambition, about recording sessions and big dreams. He had grown up in Omaha, attended 3 different high schools there without ever graduating, and had prior convictions for carrying a concealed weapon. But none of that was visible at first glance. What was visible was the charm, the energy, the way he made Tyiana feel seen. She fell for it completely. Despite warnings from her own family, people who sensed something off about Sellers, who urged her to keep her distance, Tyiana packed her life into a duffel bag and arrived in Omaha on February 21, 2005. She had known this man only briefly, yet here she was, hundreds of miles from home, in a city where she knew no one and nothing, bound entirely to a man whose true nature she had only begun to glimpse. The warnings she had been given began to take on a new weight the moment she crossed into Nebraska. Sellers had a best friend in Omaha named Terrell Thorpe, a quiet, calculating presence who seemed to always be nearby, always watching. Together, the 3 of them moved through those first days like people with somewhere to be and something to hide. It did not take long for the mask to slip. Sellers began revealing, piece by piece, what he had actually brought Tyiana to Omaha for. He needed her, not for her affection, but for her face, for the way a pretty young woman could make a stranger feel trusted, comfortable, willing to follow her somewhere alone. The plan was brutally simple. Tyiana would approach men, flirt with them, give them her number, build just enough of a connection to coax them somewhere private. And then Terry and Terrell would take everything they had, their possessions, their dignity, and ultimately their lives. He made clear, with chilling specificity, what would happen to her if she refused. One night, he pressed a .38 caliber revolver directly against Tyiana's head. He told her she was not to breathe a word to anyone, that she was not a snitch, and that there were consequences for women who became problems. Standing there, feeling the cold metal against her skull, something in Tyiana Matheni shifted. Whether from fear, from a psychological submission that her trauma had made too easy, or from some darker agreement she had made with herself, she decided not to run. She decided instead to comply. The 23rd of February, 2005, began with a trip to the mall. She went shopping with Terry. She got a manicure. She spent time in a tanning salon. She bought a pair of fuzzy boots. The sun was still up, and she was doing things that any young woman might do on a free afternoon. Ordinary things that sit now, in retrospect, like photographs placed next to a crime scene. Evidence of how normal the world continued to look even as something monstrous was being arranged just beneath its surface. That evening, the ordinariness ended. Kevin Pierce Sr. was a man who had no idea what was coming. He had a girlfriend named Erica Wilson, and together they had a daughter, a little girl who would grow up without her father because of the events of that night. Kevin had met Tyiana, spoken with her, found her friendly and approachable. She had given him her number, smiled at him in the way she had been told to smile, and now she called him and told him to come meet her near an apartment complex close to 65th Street and Grand Avenue in North Omaha. He came. He had no reason not to. Tyiana led him into position. Terry was waiting. What followed was not a robbery gone wrong, not a moment of panic or impulse. It was an execution. Tyiana raised the .38 caliber revolver to Kevin Pierce's head and pulled the trigger. He died instantly, on the ground behind that apartment building, in the dark and the cold, far from his daughter and the woman who loved him. The rims were stripped from his car before anyone drove away, removed with the calm efficiency of people who had thought the whole thing through. By the time the sun came up the next morning, Kevin Pierce was gone from the world, and the trio had scattered into the night as though nothing had happened. Omaha Police Detective Steve Henthorne arrived at the scene and found himself staring at a puzzle with no obvious corners. There were no witnesses to the shooting, no one who had seen a car drive past, heard the gunshot, or noticed anything unusual. The victim's car had been partially stripped, its rims removed and hidden. There were no identifiable fingerprints. The investigation was wide open. The detective stood in that cold parking lot knowing that somewhere in his city, the people responsible for this were still moving freely, and that he had almost nothing to go on. Less than 24 hours later, the city gave him another body. Victor Ford Jr. was found just a few blocks away, at 4403 North 62nd Street. He too had been shot in the head with a .38 caliber weapon. He too had been lured there by Tyiana Matheni. Two men killed in as many days, both in the same part of North Omaha, both by the same weapon, both without a single witness. The city was frightened. The detective was pressing harder, but the killers were still free. Terrell Thorpe had played his role carefully throughout. He did not pull triggers. He was the one who had provided the revolver used in both killings, who had served as a lookout and getaway driver, who had handed Tyiana Clorox wipes afterward and instructed her to wipe down the inside of Ford's vehicle, erasing any trace of their presence. He was methodical, unhurried, precise in the way that only someone with no conscience can be precise. He and Sellers had grown up together, had built their friendship on shared recklessness, and now they were connected by something far darker than friendship, by two bodies and a gun. There had been a third target. His name was Dwayne Kearney, and he was supposed to be the final piece of the scheme. Tyiana was to lure him just as she had lured the others, bring him to the parking lot of the Maple View apartment complex near 104th Avenue and Maple Street, and let the machinery of violence do the rest. But Dwayne Kearney did not follow the script. When the moment came, he fought back. Shots were fired and missed. Kearney fell but did not stop moving. A witness in a nearby apartment was jolted awake by the sound of a gunshot and looked out to see a man on the ground being struck by two people, a woman participating in the assault. He called 911 immediately. Sellers, in the chaos, produced a knife and stabbed Kearney. Police arrived to find Dwayne Kearney bleeding and alive, a man who had refused to become the third victim of a woman who had already helped end two lives. In the aftermath of the struggle, investigators linked the .38 caliber revolver recovered at the scene to the two murders. The gun was the thread that unraveled everything. Within days, both Terry Sellers and Tyiana Matheni were arrested and charged. Terrell Thorpe was identified through phone records and other investigative work. The case that followed was one of the most emotionally charged in Omaha's recent memory. In December 2007, during the trial of Terry Sellers, Tyiana Matheni stood in the courtroom and entered a guilty plea to second-degree murder and 2 counts of conspiracy to commit murder. In exchange for her testimony against Sellers and Thorpe, prosecutors had dropped 2 counts of first-degree murder, 3 weapons charges, and a drug charge. She faced a maximum sentence of life plus 100 years. In a strong, steady voice, she described the scheme from beginning to end. The mall visit, the fuzzy boots, the phone calls, the apartment complexes, the revolver against Kevin Pierce's head. Erica Wilson, Kevin Pierce's girlfriend and the mother of his daughter, sat in that courtroom and watched. She was not moved by Tyiana's tears. "She's the one that puts him at the scene of all 3 crimes," Matheni's own attorney said, referring to Sellers, "and she's the individual who worked with him to lure these people to their deaths." But Wilson cut through the legal maneuvering with something rawer and simpler. "I understand that they need her testimony to convict the others," she said, "but she first still took someone's life. He was my boyfriend at the time, and we had a daughter together. A daughter who would now grow up asking questions about her father and receiving answers that no child should have to carry." Terry Sellers was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. Terrell Thorpe was also found guilty as an accomplice under Nebraska law, which holds that a person can be held responsible for a death that occurs during the commission of a felony they helped plan, even if they did not pull the trigger themselves. Thorpe, too, received a life sentence. The courtroom drama had a final, chilling footnote. Matheni testified that while waiting to be transferred between facilities, she had encountered Thorpe in a holding cell. He had not said, "Tell the truth," or even "Lie for me." He had said simply, "Don't come to court." The reason, prosecutors argued, was obvious. He knew what she would say, and he knew it was true. As for Tyiana Matheni, she was sentenced to up to 80 years in prison. She told the court she was almost positive she would spend the rest of her life behind bars. She did not. In 2023, she was released, her time served deemed sufficient under the terms of her plea agreement. The news struck many in Omaha, and particularly the families of Kevin Pierce and Victor Ford, with the force of an open wound. Terry Sellers, whose supporters claim he was wrongfully convicted, and who maintains that Tyiana Matheni was the true architect of the killings rather than merely an instrument of his direction, continues to serve his life sentence in the Nebraska State Penitentiary. His supporters point to an alleged alibi witness, a woman named Jam Alexander, who reportedly told police she was with Sellers in a motel room during the night Victor Ford was killed. Testimony that, they argue, was never properly presented at trial. What endures from this case is not simple. It is not a clean story of monster and victim, though Kevin Pierce and Victor Ford were victims in every sense, men who were deceived and destroyed by people they had no reason to distrust. It is also the story of what happens when a vulnerable person meets a predatory one, when the hunger for belonging is expertly exploited, when someone is told, with a gun to their head, who they are supposed to be. Tyiana Matheni chose to pull the trigger. That cannot be undone. Kevin Pierce's daughter will carry that truth for the rest of her life, as will Victor Ford's family, as will the city of Omaha, which buried two of its sons in the same cold week and asked, as it still asks today, how something so brutal could move so quietly through its streets, wearing the face of a manicure, a tanning session, and a pair of fuzzy boots. Story 7. Mount Mariah Cemetery sits at the edge of two worlds. On one side is Yedden, a small borough in Delaware County, Pennsylvania, with its quiet residential streets and the ordinary rhythms of suburban life. On the other side, technically speaking, just across a boundary line, lies the city of Philadelphia, with all its noise and density and history. The cemetery itself belongs to neither world entirely. It sprawls across more than 200 acres of land in the American mid-Atlantic, a place of remarkable scale and equally remarkable neglect, where thousands of graves stretch in every direction beneath trees that have grown untended for years. The tombstones, many of them tilted or cracked by decades without maintenance, bear names and dates going back to the 1800s. Civil War soldiers rest here, veterans of later conflicts, ordinary men and women whose families placed them in the ground and trusted that the earth would hold them undisturbed. By the winter of 2025, that trust had begun to fracture in ways that no one yet fully understood. It started with small signs, the kind of disturbances that are easy to dismiss as the ordinary deterioration of an old and poorly maintained site. A mausoleum door that appeared to have been forced open, a crypt that seemed different than it had been, a section of the cemetery where the grass had been disturbed in ways that might have been attributed to wildlife, or weather, or the slow settling of ancient ground. The Friends of Mount Mariah Cemetery, a dedicated volunteer organization that had spent years attempting to restore and preserve the grounds when official management had long since abandoned the effort, noticed these things. They were people who cared about this place, who came on weekends with rakes and pruning shears and paint, who kept a watchful eye on a site that had no one else looking after it. And in the autumn of 2025, what they were seeing made them uneasy enough to contact law enforcement. The Yedden Borough Police Department began receiving reports and paying attention. Chief Henry J. Gianmarco Jr. and his team, along with the Delaware County District Attorney's Office Criminal Investigation Division, began to look at what was happening inside Mount Mariah's gates after dark. The investigation that followed was patient and methodical, the kind of careful, sustained surveillance that requires a great deal of waiting and a tolerance for the particular quiet of a cemetery at night. Detectives were assigned to watch. Cameras were reviewed. Patterns were studied. And slowly, across the weeks of November and December 2025, A picture began to emerge of something that most investigators, in their professional careers, had never encountered before. Someone was breaking into the mausoleums and underground burial vaults, and they were not looking for valuables in the conventional sense. They were taking the dead. Jonathan Christian Gerlach was 34 years old and lived in a modest home on the 100 block of Washington Avenue in Ephrata, a small borough in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, approximately 80 miles west of Yedden, far enough to suggest that his journeys to Mount Mariah were not casual or coincidental, but deliberate and planned. He was, by outward appearances, an unremarkable young man. Lancaster County is known for its Amish farmland and tourist markets, and the particular gentleness of small-town Pennsylvania life. His neighborhood on Washington Avenue was the kind of neighborhood where families raked their leaves and waved at neighbors walking their dogs. The house itself, from the outside, gave nothing away. What was inside it was another matter entirely. As the weeks of the investigation accumulated, Detectives Leah Sesenek of the Yedden Police Department and Christopher Carr of the Delaware County District Attorney's CID began to narrow their focus. The evidence was building: disturbed mausoleums, forced entry points, the specific pattern of access consistent with someone who had done this before, who knew the layout of the grounds, who came prepared. On the evening of January 6, 2026, Detective Sesenek and Detective Carr took up position inside and around Mount Mariah Cemetery. It was a Tuesday, and the Pennsylvania winter had settled over the land with the gray insistence of the season, the kind of cold that fills the lungs and makes the fingers numb inside gloves. The detectives waited. Around 8 o'clock in the evening, Jonathan Gerlach arrived. He entered the cemetery with the practiced ease of someone who had made this trip many times, which, as investigators would later determine, he had. He was not attempting to be invisible in the way of someone committing a crime for the first time, nervous and hesitant. He moved through the grounds with a routine familiarity, making his way to the mausoleums in the darkness, doing what he had apparently been doing since at least November 7, 2025, when the earliest of his documented crimes had taken place. The detectives watched, and when Jonathan Gerlach emerged from the cemetery and walked toward his vehicle, he was carrying a burlap bag, a crowbar, and an assortment of other items. The bag was not light. He moved with it the way a person moves when they are carrying something of substance, something that required effort to lift and effort to carry. Detective Sesenek and Detective Carr approached the vehicle. What they found in the back seat of Jonathan Gerlach's car was visible before they even opened a door. Numerous bones and skulls lay in plain view, uncovered, in the rear of the vehicle. Not hidden, not concealed under blankets or packed into containers, but simply there, resting in the back seat of an ordinary car, as though the man who had placed them there had long since stopped seeing anything unusual about it. And when the contents of the burlap bag he was carrying were examined, investigators confronted a detail that would, in the days to come, stop even the most experienced members of the law enforcement community. Inside the burlap sack were the mummified remains of 2 young children, 3 skulls, and additional bones. Jonathan Gerlach was taken into custody. He did not, at that moment, deny everything. Under questioning in the immediate aftermath of his arrest, Gerlach admitted to stealing approximately 30 sets of human remains. He told investigators which graves he had taken from, a level of specificity that confirmed he had not acted randomly, but had moved through the cemetery with deliberate selection, had returned to particular sections repeatedly, had tracked what he had taken and from where. This was not the confession of a man who had acted on a single night of disturbed impulse. This was the admission of a man who had spent months conducting what amounted to a systematic operation, site by site, vault by vault, night after night across the dying weeks of autumn and the first days of winter. The following day, investigators executed a search warrant for Gerlach's home on Washington Avenue in Ephrata. They went in prepared for what the early evidence suggested. They were not, by the accounts of law enforcement officials who spoke publicly in the days after, prepared for the full scale of what was inside. The basement of the house on Washington Avenue contained over 100 human skeletal remains. The precise inventory, as described in official statements and court documents, included more than 100 skulls, mummified hands and feet, 2 decaying torsos, and a range of other skeletal material. The remains belonged to people of different ages. They belonged to people of different eras. Some had been in the ground for more than 200 years, veterans and pioneers and ordinary Americans who had been carried to Mount Mariah by families who believed they were making a permanent and dignified arrangement on behalf of their loved ones. Investigators also searched a storage facility associated with Gerlach. The full inventory of what was recovered across the house and the storage unit ran, in the accounting of official law enforcement tallies, to the hundreds, a number that the Delaware County District Attorney, Tanner Rouse, described publicly in language that spoke more of bewilderment than of the usual measured official statement. The enormity of what we are looking at, the sheer utter lack of any reasonable explanation, it's difficult to say right now exactly what took place, Rouse told reporters, adding, "We're trying to figure it out." What investigators could piece together fairly quickly, however, was that Jonathan Gerlach had not been collecting these remains for himself alone. He had been selling them. A social media group called the Human Bones and Skull Selling Group became a central element of the investigation. The group existed precisely as its name described, a marketplace where human skeletal material was bought and sold through social media, operating, with an apparent casualness, on one of the most widely used platforms in the world. Gerlach was connected to this group. He had been tagged in a post on the group's page, photographed holding a skull with the easy confidence of someone who has entirely normalized what they are doing. He had, investigators believed, been using the group to sell remains stolen from Mount Mariah, turning mausoleums that grieving families had paid to maintain into an inventory source for an online marketplace. Chief Gianmarco, when he spoke to reporters about the case, captured the particular absurdity and horror of this aspect with a line that circulated widely in the coverage that followed. "I can't sell my grandchildren's old car seats, but I can go on Marketplace and sell a skull." It was not a funny observation. It was a furious one. The statement of a law enforcement official confronting the gap between the platform's content policies and the reality of what had been facilitated across it. On January 8, 2026, Jonathan Christian Gerlach was arraigned and charged with 496 counts spanning an extraordinary range of offenses. The charges included 100 counts each of abuse of corpse, theft by unlawful taking, and receiving stolen property. They included 26 counts each of burglary, criminal trespass, intentional desecration of a public monument, intentional desecration of a venerated object, intentional desecration of historical lots and burial places, and criminal mischief. They included 14 counts of criminal trespassing under additional statutes. Each count corresponded to a documented act, a specific grave violated, a specific set of remains disturbed, a specific piece of evidence tied to a specific location within the cemetery grounds. Bail was set at $1 million cash. Gerlach was held in Delaware County Prison. The scale of the investigation, which had drawn in not only the Edinburgh Police Department and the Delaware County District Attorney's Office, but also the Philadelphia Police Department, the Lancaster County District Attorney, the Ephrata Police Department, the Delaware County Medical Examiner's Office, and the Lancaster County Coroner's Office, spoke to how quickly the case had grown beyond the boundaries of a single jurisdiction. Mount Mariah Cemetery straddles both Yedin and Philadelphia, and the crimes had taken place across both sides of that line. Additional charges were confirmed as pending for thefts committed on the Philadelphia side of the grounds, expanding the case further still. For the families of those buried at Mount Mariah, the investigation's findings arrived as a particular kind of devastation, one that is difficult to name precisely because it sits outside the ordinary vocabulary of loss. The people in those mausoleums and burial vaults had already been mourned. Their families had already endured the grief of death and burial and the hard years of learning to carry an absence. What Jonathan Gerlach had done was reach backward into that grief and disturb it in a way that most of those families had never imagined needing to fear. The people they had buried were gone, and now some of them were gone in a second and entirely different sense, their remains having passed through a burlap bag in a car back seat in a Pennsylvania basement and potentially an online marketplace. The Yedin Police Department moved immediately to attempt notifications. Chief Gianmarco issued a direct public appeal to any family with a loved one interred in a mausoleum or underground burial vault at Mount Mariah, asking them to contact the department. The process of identifying whose remains had been disturbed and whose had not was complex, time-consuming, and deeply distressing for everyone involved: the investigators who had to conduct it, and the families who were waiting to find out whether the person they had buried was still where they had been placed. Mount Mariah Cemetery had a history that, in the context of this case, made the violation feel even larger. It was not simply a cemetery. It was a place of genuine historical significance, a site where, among thousands of others, Civil War veterans had been laid to rest, where names carved into stone connected the living to generations of American history, going back more than 2 centuries. It had, over the decades, fallen into disrepair after its commercial management company abandoned active maintenance. The Friends of Mount Mariah Cemetery had been working for years to preserve it, a volunteer effort driven by a sincere sense of duty to the dead and to the families who had placed them there. These were people who came on weekends to clean and restore and protect a space that had no official protector. Their early reports to law enforcement had been among the first indications that something was wrong inside those gates. The method that Gerlach allegedly used to gain entry to the mausoleums added another layer of calculated effort to the portrait that was emerging. According to court records and law enforcement statements, he had rappelled into some of the enclosed structures, using rope or similar equipment to lower himself through openings or from elevated positions into spaces that were otherwise sealed. This was not opportunistic vandalism. This was a sustained physical operation requiring preparation, equipment, physical capability, and repeated commitment. Someone who rappels into mausoleums and returns on multiple nights over the course of 2 months has not stumbled into a crime. They have constructed one, deliberately and over time. As January 2026 moved into February and March, the legal proceedings around the case began to move through the court system with the characteristic pace of complex, multi-charge criminal matters. The preliminary hearing scheduled for January 20th was postponed. The February date did not hold either. By March 2026, the hearing had been delayed again, at the request of Gerlach's public defender, who cited new information received by the defense without specifying its nature. The hearing was rescheduled to April. In the meantime, the investigation remained, in the language of the official statements, active and ongoing. Multiple locations were still being searched. The full accounting of what had been taken, and from whom, was not yet complete. CBS News Philadelphia confirmed, through sources close to the case, that additional charges were forthcoming for thefts on the Philadelphia side of the cemetery, expanding an already staggering charge sheet further still. Among the most quietly unsettling elements of the case, beyond the sheer scale of the crimes, was the visibility with which at least some of the activity had apparently been conducted. The Facebook group, the photograph of a man holding a skull, tagged publicly. The backseat of a car with bones and skulls lying in plain view, not concealed, not hidden, as though the person transporting them had arrived at a place where the ordinary signals of shame or concealment had ceased to function. Delaware County District Attorney Tanner Rouse, standing before reporters in the cold of a January afternoon, acknowledged what he was looking at with a directness that suggested a man still processing the full dimensions of the case he had inherited. For the residents of the neighborhood on Washington Avenue in Ephrata, the days following Gerlach's arrest brought a particular species of shock, the kind that comes not from violence, but from proximity to something one's imagination had never prepared for. Neighbors spoke to reporters about the ordinary surfaces of their block, the unremarkable house on the 100 block, the man who had lived there without apparent incident or drama, without any external sign that within those walls lay the accumulated plunder of a cemetery, the remains of more than 100 people arranged in a basement in ways that investigators described with a careful professionalism that barely contained the horror underneath it. Mount Mariah Cemetery itself, as of early 2026, remained the subject of an active and ongoing forensic effort. Law enforcement teams continued to work through the grounds, attempting to determine the full scope of the violations, which structures had been entered, which had not, which graves remained undisturbed, and which had been stripped by a man with a crowbar and a burlap bag and a car left running in the dark outside the gate. Jonathan Christian Gerlach, held in Delaware County Prison on $1 million bail, awaited the continuation of his preliminary hearing. He was 34 years old. He was, in the language of the American legal system, presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law, a presumption the Yedin Police Department was careful to note even in the announcement of his arrest. The evidence that had accumulated against him, from the bones in his back seat to the skulls in his basement to the photograph on Facebook to the confession he had given in the hours after his arrest, would be tested in court in the months to come, weighed against the full apparatus of legal procedure, examined by prosecutors and defense attorneys, and ultimately placed before a judge. In the meantime, families across Delaware County and Philadelphia were waiting for a phone call or an email from the Yedin Police Department, waiting to learn whether the person they had grieved and buried and trusted to the permanence of the ground had been left alone or had become, in the terrible accounting of this case, one of the more than 100. For those families, the criminal charges and the legal proceedings and the question of what ultimately happened to Jonathan Gerlach were secondary to a simpler and more personal question, one that no court verdict and no sentence could fully resolve. They simply wanted to know if the people they loved were still where they had been placed. And in too many cases, the answer was no. Story 8. The house on Lake Alice Road was a world unto itself. Nestled in the lush, green quiet of Fall City, a rural enclave 30 minutes outside the glittering modernity of Seattle, it was a place deliberately set apart. To the passing eye, it was just another home, surrounded by the dense, evergreen curtain of the Pacific Northwest. But within its walls, Mark and Sarah Humiston had cultivated a life of radical isolation, a fortress built against a world they had come to distrust. Their 6 children were the sole inhabitants of this private kingdom, their lives governed by a rigid code of faith, fear, and survivalism that left little room for the outside world. Mark, 43, and his wife Sarah, 42, were architects of this self-contained universe. They were driven by a deep-seated paranoia, a fear of the government, of modern medicine, and of a society they believed was morally adrift. The COVID-19 pandemic had only deepened their convictions, solidifying their retreat from public life. Their children were homeschooled, their social interactions carefully curated, limited to a small, select group of families from their church who shared their worldview. They were raising their children not for the world as it was, but for the world as they feared it would become. A place of collapse and chaos where only the prepared would survive. Firearms were not just for sport, they were essential tools, and the children were raised under a rigid, militant survivalist ideology, where knowledge of guns was part of the curriculum. This isolated world, however, was not a utopia. It was a pressure cooker. The home was an abusive and tightly controlled environment, dominated by extreme religious beliefs. Sarah, the mother, was allegedly demeaning and emotionally abusive towards the children, a fact that their maternal grandmother had reportedly threatened to report to the authorities if it did not stop. At the center of this brewing storm was the eldest son. At 15, he was beginning to chafe under the suffocating weight of his parents' control. He was the black sheep, the one who felt unfairly targeted, his every move scrutinized, his every failing magnified. The pressure was immense. He was the only one of the children who knew the combination to the locked gun safe where his father, Mark, kept his Glock pistol, a responsibility that in this family was likely seen as a sign of trust, a coming of age in their survivalist world. But in the troubled mind of a teenage boy pushed to his breaking point, this knowledge was not a key to trust, but to a terrible and final form of rebellion. In the dark, quiet hours of a cool October night, he began to form a plan not to escape his family's world, but to utterly annihilate it. The final hours of the Humiston family began with a transgression that, in any other home, would have been a minor disciplinary issue. On the night of Sunday, October 20th, 2024, 13-year-old Benjamin was caught looking at adult content. In the hyper-vigilant, morally rigid world of the Humiston household, this was a grave sin, a breach of the fortress walls, an intrusion of the very corruption his parents sought to keep out. The fallout, the arguments, the punishments that likely followed can only be imagined, but it was this event that the eldest son would later seize upon as the catalyst for the horror he was about to unleash. In the pre-dawn darkness of Monday, October 21st, while the rest of Fall City slept, the house on Lake Alice Road became a tomb. At around 4:30 a.m., the 15-year-old rose from his bed. He walked to the gun safe, his fingers steady as he entered the combination only he knew. The heavy door swung open, and he took out his father's Glock pistol. The cold, metallic weight of it in his hand must have felt like absolute power, a final answer to the powerlessness that had been consuming him. He moved through the house with a chilling, systematic precision. He was a hunter in his own home, his family the unsuspecting prey. He went to his parents' room first. His father, Mark, was found in the upstairs hallway, shot 4 times. His mother, Sarah, had tried to escape. She had made it to the master bathroom, the splintered door frame a silent testament to her desperate, final attempt to barricade herself in. He had forced the door open and shot her twice in the head. The younger children were next. 9-year-old Joshua and 7-year-old Catherine lay in the hallway outside their bedrooms, their small bodies stilled by the same cold, methodical violence. He then found his 13-year-old brother, Benjamin, near the stairs. He shot him, the brother who would soon become the centerpiece of his elaborate deception. His final target was his 11-year-old sister. He found her and shot her, the bullet striking her in the neck and hand. But in a miraculous twist of fate, in the only moment of mercy that dark morning, she survived. With a presence of mind that defied her age and her terror, she held her breath and played dead. Believing his work to be complete, her brother moved on, leaving her for dead. The house fell silent, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and the profound, terrible stillness of death. At 4:55 a.m., a call came into the King County 911 dispatch center. The caller was a teenage boy, his voice breathless, laced with a carefully constructed panic. "He just shot my whole family and committed suicide too," he said. He identified himself as the eldest son, and he told the dispatcher that his 13-year-old brother, Benjamin, had snapped. He claimed he was hiding in a bathroom, that he had waited 10 to 15 minutes after the last shot before daring to call. He offered a motive, a pre-packaged explanation for the carnage. Benjamin had been caught looking at adult content, and the shame and anger had driven him to murder his family before taking his own life. It was a chilling performance, a lie designed to cast him as the traumatized survivor and his dead brother as the monstrous villain. But his story began to unravel almost immediately. 7 minutes after his call, at 5:02 a.m., a second, frantic call came into the 911 center. It was from a neighbor, Bradley Denise. A child was at his door, ringing the doorbell over and over, hysterical. It was the 11-year-old Humiston girl. She was bleeding from her neck and hand, but she was alive, and she had a story to tell. She had escaped through a window and run for her life. She told the dispatcher that her family was all dead, but it wasn't Benjamin who had killed them. It was her eldest brother. He was the one who had shot her. She had played dead, and it had saved her life. When the first King County Sheriff's deputies arrived at the scene at 5:12 a.m., they found the 15-year-old waiting for them in the driveway. He offered no resistance as they took him into custody. They then entered the house, stepping into a scene of unimaginable horror. The bodies of his parents and 3 of his siblings were scattered through the home, just as the boy on the phone had described. But the story he had told was already falling apart. They found Benjamin's body near the stairs, the Glock pistol placed in his left hand, a clumsy attempt to stage a suicide. The ruse was transparent. The medical examiner would later confirm that Benjamin had been shot from at least 2 feet away, an impossible angle for a self-inflicted wound. The survivor's testimony and the forensic evidence pointed to one inescapable conclusion. The boy in the driveway was not a survivor. He was a family annihilator. The aftermath of the Humiston family massacre sent a shockwave of horror through the community of Falls City and the nation. The public was left to grapple with a question that had no easy answer. How could a 15-year-old boy systematically murder his entire family? The investigation that followed began to peel back the layers of the family's isolated world, revealing a life that was, to the outside, a mystery. Friends and neighbors described the family as active in their church community, but also as intensely private and insular. The children were rarely seen interacting with peers outside of a small, church-approved circle. As the legal proceedings began, the picture became darker. The defense, in court filings, painted a portrait of a deeply dysfunctional and abusive household, a tightly controlled environment dominated by extreme religious beliefs and a militant survivalist ideology. They alleged that the mother, Sarah, was abusive and demeaning to the children, claims that were reportedly corroborated by the children's maternal grandmother. The eldest son, the accused, was allegedly singled out, the black sheep, who bore the brunt of this toxic family dynamic. The defense began to build a narrative not of a cold-blooded killer, but of a victim of long-term abuse who had finally and horrifically snapped. The legal system was now faced with a complex and delicate task. On October 22nd, the day after the murders, the accused was scheduled for his first court appearance, but he chose not to attend. A judge ordered him to remain in juvenile custody and to have no contact with his surviving sister. On October 25th, he appeared in court for the first time, quiet and expressionless, his gaze fixed on the judge's bench as the gravity of his situation began to unfold. He was charged with 5 counts of first-degree aggravated murder and 1 count of first-degree attempted murder. The most critical question facing the court was not one of guilt. The evidence was overwhelming, but of jurisdiction. The King County Prosecutor's Office filed a motion to have a discretionary decline hearing, a legal proceeding to argue that the case should be moved from juvenile court to adult court. The stakes of this hearing were monumental. If the case remained in juvenile court, the maximum sentence he could receive would be confinement until the age of 25, at which point he would be released. If he were tried and convicted as an adult, he would face a sentence of 25 years to life in prison. The hearing was set for June 4, 2025, a date that would determine the entire future of the boy who had ended his family's future in a single bloody morning. The defense attorneys, arguing that their client's version of events was forensically viable despite the evidence, sought to delay the hearing, needing more time to prepare and to counter the prosecution's narrative. They planned to argue that the accused was a product of an abusive and extreme environment, a factor they hoped would persuade the judge to keep the case in the juvenile system. The case of the Humiston family is a chilling American tragedy, a story that speaks to the dark undercurrents of extremism, isolation, and abuse that can fester behind a placid suburban facade. It is the story of a fortress that became a prison, and a prison that became a slaughterhouse. For the outside world, the family was an enigma, their retreat from society a curiosity. For the children inside, it was the only reality they knew. One of them, a girl of 11, found the strength and courage to survive, her desperate flight for help the only reason the truth of that terrible morning was known. Her brother, the boy who pulled the trigger, now sits in a juvenile detention center, his fate hanging in the balance of a legal system trying to mete out justice for a crime that almost defies comprehension. The house on Lake Alice Road stands silent now, a monument to a family that destroyed itself from within, leaving behind only the haunting question of how a world built to keep danger out could have nurtured such a monster inside.